I'd like to welcome you today to this webinar. It's a beautiful day here in Atlanta, and we're pleased to have you joining us wherever you may be. Today, we get to discuss how to communicate during the 6 stages of crisis. Today, it's stage 5, the resolution phase. And as has been for the last 4 stages, Dr. Robert Chandler is with us, who is a true expert in this field. If you want to watch previous items in this series, please go to firestorm.com and you can watch the recordings of the previous webinars, and you can register for future ones. We'd also like you to become our friend. On Facebook, we're Firestorm Solutions. On Twitter, we're Firestorm Solo. There is a hashtag. That hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage risk and crises. Firestorm expertise is crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind, the presentation today is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion, and the work product reviewed must be read and considered in conjunction with advice from your organization's personal counsel. In addition, do not interpret the comments or the content of this webinar to be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. Dr. Robert Chandler is with us today, along with Jim Satterfield, president and founder of Firestorm. Jim, over to you, please.
Well, we're excited to be back talking about number 5 in this series, but we're also really excited to have Dr. Chandler back in the good old US of A. Dr. Chandler's just back from being in China. Bob, before we get started, is there something you want to share with us about what it's like there? Or are they just as up to date on business continuity and crisis management? Is there a time lag? What's your perception in coming from China and just having spoken on this subject?
Well, thank you, Jim. And there's a huge interest in this. I think if anybody has been following the news, it seems like China gets more than its fair share of disasters and events, and they're actually going through a huge shift from a centralized, industrialized economy to a decentralized information consumer economy, new notions of accountability with the change in the legal structure there. Obviously, technology is a big part of it. They are far ahead of us in terms of e-commerce, Internet Plus. Actually, there's several interesting webinars just on those concepts. On the other hand, what I found is that their both theoretical and practical background really lags where we're at. I got questions that I would have gotten 10, 12, 15 years ago. So they're hungry to catch up. They're very, very eager. It was very good. They were very gracious, and a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of real hunger to begin to manage, and for them is a whole new world and a whole new kind of circumstances, and without any of the backup that all of us have over the last decade or two, where we've kind of learned a few things. So it's a tremendous place of opportunity, a tremendous place of eagerness, and I came back very optimistic about the prospect of teaching and training and collaborating and providing services and things for them, and I think they're very eager for it, Jim.
Well, the global marketplace that we all find ourselves in today, it's reinforced, and I know in the coming weeks you're going to be back over doing another crisis communications in the health emergency area in Alabama, and then you'll be joining us all at the DRJ in San Diego here very shortly. Bob will be giving a speech on Tuesday morning, and we'll be at the Firestorm booth. And if you want to bring your crisis communications plan or your crisis communications questions by the Firestorm booth, Bob will be available to provide some insights. And then right after that, he comes back and has a couple more speaking engagements, and then we're going to be doing an association exercise for someone in the food services area, and then you're off to Austria. So lots of things on the horizon and coming up, as well as the number 6 in the series. But today we're focused on number 5, the resolution phase. And as Bill said at the very beginning, this series has been recorded and is available, and there are briefs associated with each one of them, and it would be a good topic for us to continue to share and use as a way to grow your business and to be prepared in those individual areas. So when we think about the resolution phase, Bob, and you've shared many times how these all overlap, and sometimes it's hard to figure out when one's actually starting and another one's going together. Any general comments before we start to get under the covers and look at this resolution phase?
Sure, let me just restate what I say all the time. I mean, this is a planning tool. I don't think this is a model for a model's sake. I'm suggesting, quite frankly and very forthrightly, that as you think about communication, and actually as you think about all of your crisis management handlings, this particular model basically is a way of understanding that a crisis is a living, changing, dynamic, evolving, multiplying, subdividing event, and that you really ought to think in terms of being prepared for the different phases of these events. And that's really the main point. And today we're at the resolution phase, which is the phase we all hope to get to as quickly and efficiently and safely as possible. So this ought to be the first smiley face phase that we've had. It's true, at least a sigh of relief phase. But yet it's interesting because now all of the communication strategies, plans that we have are very different. We have been so busy mobilizing and managing and responding, and that now we're actually at that point where we have to start thinking about demobilizing, turning off the things we activated, shutting down the emergency, and thinking about getting us out of here and reassuring people. So that's really the resolution phase.
And obviously,
go ahead.
Bob, I agree with you. People are glad to think about it's now over. There's still hot washes and other reviews and analysis to do, but you've been dealing with the problem and trying to get the react area and the respond going forward, and now we're in that fifth stage that you focused on. So please move ahead.
Well, and I think the other thing is some people think it's all done. And if anyone's been through a crisis, you realize there's as many questions, there's as many loose ends, there's follow-up. And so resolution is our first step. In fact, the last phase that we'll talk about in a few weeks is recovery, which is a whole new set of problems. But this is really the idea of turning off the fire hydrant that we've been getting all the water from, and beginning to understand that. And it's just as critical, and it's really just as critical because this includes all of the processes to be in touch with everyone who's been mobilized or asked to evacuate or respond or change, and all of our employees as well as our partners, our community, neighbors. It's everybody involved. It's now to begin to contact them to explain we're now in a wind down. The danger has passed. The storm is over. The flood waters have receded. We're not worried about rising waters and more people being threatened. We're now worried about trying to find out where people are and do they know where to go next, and are they safe, and caregiving. This to me, I mean, I think all the phases are important, so I'm biased, but this one is the one I believe gets overlooked a lot. The idea of truly planning, having in your plan, how do we resolve and communicate resolution to everyone else, and I think that's very important. I think further. This really is the point where you begin to, you mentioned a hot wash. I think this is where we begin, actually there's a lot to do before you get to the after action review phase, but this is the point where you begin to try to collect feedback. This is an equally as important phase for listening. People will have so many questions. Have you anticipated those? When I do resolution plans, communication plans, we touch everything from where to get help and counseling and relocation to HR questions and will I get paid, and questions such as where and when do I report back to work because our building has smoke damage or flood waters or crime scene tapes or whatever it might be. And also your people have been stressed out in this. And so a lot of the normal processes for how insurance information is normally communicated to your employees or even your customers, those people may have been affected. They may be displaced. They may be unavailable. And so the stress is on. And typically, you have extreme resolution phases where you're still dealing with infrastructure damage. I mean, you may not get electricity after the hurricane for days or, dare I say, weeks. You know, the ATMs may not be working, the traffic lights may not be working, the gasoline pumps may not be working. And so even though the danger, even though the storm has blown over, yeah, you may still be in a contingent situation. You may still be in a critical situation. That's just to get things back. Now, cleanup and recovery, we'll deal with that in the longer phase, but this is this transitional phase that gets us from acute to basically complicated. So roll forward here one more here.
Okay. And one thing that hit me on that page, Bob, was where you had the word all. You needed to contact everyone that you've touched base up to this point. And I think a lot of times that gets lost in this process.
Well, we talk a lot. In fact, I'm not going to be critical of approaches because it is important to do about notifying people, alerting people, connecting with people, activating plans, and going to hot mode. And it's so funny. I have plenty of debriefing of people who never got told to deactivate or switch. Now, you say, oh, they'll figure it out in a few hours or days, but that's just so inefficient and it's rough on the people. I really think you need to be able to retrace your steps. And so everyone, whether it's community and families, spouses, vendors, customers, it doesn't matter. If you've been alerting to them about the event, how you're managing it, you must have as strong as a plan and great messages to let them know, hey, we're resolving this, it's coming to a close, and this involves a great deal of push and pull. I mean, basically, on a personal level, you may have got my adrenaline running in this event. I may be exhausted. I may not have slept. I may have had psychological stress. It's a lot of things that my heart rate may still be going fast. And part of this is to begin to think of how do we speak to people to talk about this. And you know, it's even more complicated, Jim, if there has been, you know, in the storm or in the tornado or in the flood or in the active shooter or in the financial crisis, there are people who are hurt. There are people who are bruised both physically and psychologically. And so if you have an acute crisis, then we've got to begin to have an acute response to help resolve that. And you know, I think that it's a very comprehensive sort of plan that has to be drawn up. If you're working with a school district, you know, where is the counseling staff and what is the plan and where do you put the students and what's the combination and who's your partner? And those things are very important. I mean, even your own team, even your own, whether it's an emergency management team, incident command team, doesn't really matter to me what your structure is. The principle is the same. Your leaders have to be able to just as deliberately and carefully communicate to the relevant audience, just contact everybody to mobilize this sort of idea of all clear notifications. You know, we got the all clears came with really the where I learned about it in school was the public warning sirens that went off from air raids. And you know, the idea being that you got all these people cowering in an air raid shelter, and you've sounded the alarms to get them there. What you don't want to do is leave them cowering there, trapped in their bunkers, and not tell them what's going on. And so the resolution phase is the metaphorical equivalent of that, of the all clear notifications, the status of you can come out now, you can take a breath now. Now, that doesn't mean they're fully recovered, and that's a whole nother process. But if you skip this step, that you miss people, you leave them in gaps, and you discover them hours, days, years later still hyperventilating because of what it was. And so what's your plan? How do you do that? And how do you begin to wind back? By the way, that's where I think having not only a plan but good tools and good people with training. I think that if you have a declarative, somebody declares something, an alert, or declares a plan active or activates a status, you need to have just as clear declarative closure measures as you did to initiate it. And the same groups of people that were told that it was initiated need now to be told that it's no longer initiated, and let them know we're back to normal reporting channels, we're back to normal schedules, or whatever it might be. But with the addition of providing a little bit of soft messages. So we were so urgent for action earlier on, we went we're on active status, go to your stations, red alert, battle stations, that sort of thing. Now we need to think more in terms of how we word messages to provide reassurance, confidence, help them understand stability, because different people react differently during these events, and there could very well be anxiety. The studies on people that have gone through these events really affect them on both the physical level, the psychometric level. That's a whole line of my research. So when I teach recovery phase messages, I really emphasize that now we need to, I guess, I'm saying that we have to be very sensitive. And that's really my point here. And we have to be very compassionate and understanding. And what may be critically urgent to someone to know, you may not see as a high priority, yet it needs to be addressed in this phase anyway, because you understand your audience, you know what they need to do. So we're going to address the change of status. We're going to do it in a way that's empathetic and sympathetic, and that we're going to now foreshadow, because now you're beginning a process of recovery. Actually, recovery is often the longest of all the stages. I can, with just a few exceptions, I can think of when people say, well, Bob, which one of these phases or stages lasts the longest? And I always say recovery. Recovery happens both on a physical level, operational level, emotional level, people level, process level. It can, rebuilding, cleaning up, fixing, repairs, planning for the future, debriefing, all of those things often is the longest one. And now, I'm not suggesting we launch into that, because we're going to save that for the last webinar to plan how do you communicate all that. What we're talking about is that we have to communicate a transition from basically, duck and cover to come out. It's okay to come out now. You should also begin to provide places so people can see the timeline for anticipated recovery. I think part of the resolution phase is to answer people's questions about the next phase. They're going to say, well, what happens now? In fact, the question, what happens next, is one of the most common ones we get during the resolution phase. What now? What next? Sometimes that's in the form of what's the next shoe to drop. They want to know what the other risks are, and you have to address that, but sometimes it's very procedural. So if our goals in stages 1, 2, 3, and 4 have basically been to mobilize people for a response and management, then stage 5 is the reverse. We're going to change directions. Have you ever been on? I've been on a jetliner a lot recently, having just got back from China and making 2 or 3 other trips. And I noticed that the plane has these wonderful jet engines providing all this thrust, moving us forward. And when it finally comes time to land, we hit the runway, and we don't want to leave those jet afterburners on. In fact, not only do we want to cut the power, even that's not enough. In fact, the jets I've been on recently don't just cut down the engines and coast to a stop. What they actually do is reverse thrust. And in a sense, that's what we're talking about in this stage, is we're going to reverse thrust on this. We're going to try and slow things back down, calm, orderly, and we want to be a wellspring of information. By the way, this is a phase, resolution is when everyone else thinks you've got a lot of time to begin answering stuff, and if you're on the inside, you don't have a lot of time. But these may come from the media. You may get the media. You may get your critics online, social media, that want to talk about your emergency schedules and why you're shifting back now, and why didn't you do it sooner, and why didn't you do it later? Are you reassigning people? If somebody's been told off 24/7 to work on a team, do you send them home at this point, or just send them back to their normal routine? And do you debrief them? I haven't even talked about debriefing yet. This recovery stage is where you should really think about a formal operational debriefing, but in most examples that I have studied, you need to think about a well-being debriefing. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but that is certainly something we've learned in the recovery phase that you're going to have to talk about. I think that you should have all of this ready. In fact, you should know right now what your recovery steps would be. Surely you have a business impact analysis that says if you lose a certain building, you know where you're going to go for, you know how long it's estimated to take to build a new facility or repair a facility, and you should know what happens in terms of everything from work schedules to where I park, to my equipment is there, what do I do? My guess is that you've got these plans on the shelf, but you need a version of this so that people understand that you're addressing these issues. I also think you have to keep the pulse of it. So I definitely think it includes the forecast of the upcoming steps, And again, without getting into the actual, how do you communicate recovery information and coordinate it, right now we've just got an information hunger. So we want to address the uncertainty. We want to address the what next question. Frankly, if you've just come through a hurricane and there's 3 more lined up in the ocean aimed at you, then the what next message is a little bit different than if, oh, we'll never get another tornado again. Some of the most, what was the, I'm trying to think, there was a, I think it was in the Philippines a year or so ago, where they had a typhoon, a hurricane that came ashore, followed by a devastating earthquake, followed by another hurricane, and you can't get any more complicated what next than to just keep getting these things real. I also think that resolution communication is where we're going to begin to get the supplemental explanation and post-event analysis. You mentioned a hot wash and debriefing. That's probably more focused on how you handled the event, how your systems work. But I think there's a lot of it that people want to know. So what went on? What happened? Information thus far, as we've talked about, is changing. You've dealt with rumors, misinformation, all this other stuff went through the first phases. Those don't just drift away at this point. So are you prepared to do that? And are your policies and procedures flexible enough to communicate that? Resolution is also a time, and I don't have it on the slide here, but it's really a time when the why questions get asked. You may say, well, we need to take some days to think about why we did this, why we didn't do this, did it work, did it not work? You should anticipate you're going to be asked these questions, and these will come from your insiders, these will come from your employees, your stakeholders. It will come from the news media, it will come from other places, and you're going to say, well, we really haven't had time to think about this stuff, we've been so busy running the crisis, and that's probably a true and honest statement. That doesn't mean you still won't get the questions. And so why didn't you have a policy in place, and what are you going to do now since you've lost so much of your workforce, or you've lost so many facilities, or you've been leaking oil in the Gulf of Mexico, or whatever it might be. You got the well capped, I get that. But what now? What are you going to do with the aftermath? What is the recovery? What is the cleanup? Those are real questions that get asked, and hopefully you're never on the receiving end of, okay, finally after months you managed to get the oil well capped, but this ain't over. To me it's obvious, but some people, I really want you, and what's your communication plan for that period of this ain't over? And I think it's very good. Yeah, Jim.
When I look at this and I see the words here, is it your understanding, and from having talked to probably more people about communications in each of these 6 stages than anyone else, as we look at it, are people generally looking for a change now? That there must be a change in our policy procedure as a result of whatever happened? It's the only way that on some levels you can make some sense out of this. Is this a key driver for them?
Yeah, the desire for change is there. I would say it's trumped by 2 things. One is accountability. Everybody wants to know who's accountable, who's responsible. And the truth is sometimes there's no one to blame, but people are looking for that. And so part of it is not just the change aspect, but it's who's taking responsibility and accountability, and if it worked or didn't work. And how could it be made better even if things are working, and do it. And I think change comes in as kind of the part B or part C of that effort, which is, so what are you going to do differently? What are you doing differently now and next time? And can we see evidence of that? That's the biggest critique I get from a lot of after-action reviews and lessons learned, is that we identify them, but we don't actually learn from or change our practice. So, oh yeah, we knew not to do. We know we should have had a plan for that, but that does really, it's irrelevant if you don't actually put a plan into place and test it. I mean, I've got thousands of examples of stuff that came out of after-action reviews that everybody said this would be a great idea, but nobody did anything with it. That's a little longer term than resolution. I'm a little off topic, but certainly that kind of spirit is there. So what do you do in the resolution phase? I'm suggesting right now that you need to plan in the situation after the storm has passed, after the oil well's been capped. The active shooter is down and in custody. Okay, we're at that point in a crisis. Whatever, pick anything. It doesn't matter. We got to let people know what's your plan for doing it. And obviously, it's a whole different view of messages than when you first heard there was an active shooter in the building. I mean, the messages, the behavioral instructions are different. And this is a great example of where when people talk about crisis communication, they plan for a one-dimensional set of communication plans. I would say we would never communicate in the same way to the same people and the same methods for resolution that I would in the incident occurs and the response. And so how are you planning for it? How are you going to contact people? What kind of messages, and that means both information and tone and style, and of course the modalities. You just want to say, well, we really care for your well-being. Please press 1 if you're psychologically bothered. Press 2 if you're emotionally unstable. I mean, there's so many levels of meta messages that I think it's a fair question. And I like when I work with groups, I just ask them. I say, you tell me. What is your approach to doing this? I mean, you've got all these people, and the shooter's down, the tornado has passed, the sirens are off, maybe even they're sounding all clear. The oil well is capped, so tell me what you're going to say next. And I am stunned at how many people don't have a plan for that. Like, well, it'll sort out eventually. I wouldn't leave it to chance. I guess that's my big push here. I think you actually plan for stage 5. I think you actually, you should have all sorts of go-to materials and information on that. If all this falls on the shoulders of your HR department, then they should be quite aware that this is going to fall on their shoulders, that we have to tell people where to get their alternative paycheck because the direct deposit system's down, or vice versa. They can't get a paper paycheck because it's done electronically and all that's there. I mentioned before about debriefing on a personal level, and I really want to address that. Over the years, resolution, the thing that has emerged in my mind is that you've got people who've experienced a very stressful, perhaps even traumatic event. It does affect people. It changes them. It shapes them. It can produce dysfunction. You have high levels of uncertainty, high levels of anxiety. Many people are physically engaged, not just because they were hurt or injured, but we get excited, our adrenaline runs, our heart rate changes. It affects everything from respiration to actually bodily functions. People get scared, and yes, they can, we'll just say, wet their pants. Look, you've got people who've gone through quite a bit of it. Your resolution messages have to be grounded in an approach that begins to understand that you're dealing with vulnerable people. More so, less so, I know you've got tough people, and they can, no matter what they've seen or witnessed, they'll be fine and whistling through their work. But I think in the real world, most of us understand, and resolution is the step one for psychological first aid and recovery. It is not the end of the story. It can't all be mapped into this, but you cannot communicate in the resolution phase without taking into account psychometric, psychological, emotional, mental, cognitive first aid for people. And you would do that just as much as you would provide physical first aid. If you've got people after tornado passed and they're bleeding, then by golly, give them first aid. Bandage it, stop the bleeding, get them into a healthcare facility. The same is true for individuals who have suffered all of these other things. And so as they've had this increasing level of physical, psychometric discomfort and disruption during these events, we have to begin to think in the resolution phase of that kind of psychological first aid. First words matter. It's talking person to person. Are you okay? Let's sit down. Let's meet with our. Some of you will already have your counseling team may be around. It is so much different than please call this number. Press 1 if you're suicidal. Press 2 if you're. It's just there's an impersonal and a personal way of doing it. I'm suggesting that you pay as much attention to this as you do with the EMTs and the rescue units trying to get people out of the collapsed building.
And so what I'm hearing, Bob, is that of all the communications area, this is the one that's more one-on-one, than the other broadcast announcements through your mass notification system or something else. This is more custom one-on-one on that individual to individual personal level in order to deal with it. It's not a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, I think you target the other messages. I wouldn't say you don't target them, but I think in this case, we're now adding a dimension that we haven't really had an opportunity to deal with. I mean, we've been trying to keep the gunmen trapped in a room, or, you know, we've been trying to put out the wildfire. It's frankly, unless you have unlimited resources, you know, if you have unlimited resources, please call me. I can help with that. You know, I'd be happy to help with that. And but most of us don't have unlimited resources. You probably can't have a parallel team while the wildfire's raging through, worrying about that. Now, frankly, once the wildfire's through, you need to turn the resources you have. And yes, call it interpersonal, one-on-one, but now we need to know how individuals are. And we do know that people aren't affected the same. I mean, there are stoic people who their office is destroyed, and that's no big deal. I'll go work in another office. There are other people that are really seriously touched by that, and they go in and look at the melted telephone, or they look at the grandkid portrait from the fellow who was gunned down by the active shooter, and they come all to pieces. And so you need to think about how you're going to talk about this. This is, you know, I have a really bad sense of humor, and people criticize me all the time. You know, probably resolution communication. I would be tempted to make a bad joke or something, and I'm glad I have people around me to keep me in control, because they're very fragile. And not everybody, but this is where people put their foot in the mouth. I mean, remember, what we're doing during this whole crisis is we're trying to coordinate how we deal with it. And yes, we need to deal with the floodwaters. We need to deal with the gunmen. We need to deal with the chemical spill. And you know, but now that we got the people coming out of decon, and here they are, and they're standing there in those silly paper underwears, and really scared, because that was anthrax in that bottle. And so we've been mobilizing them, and yeah, we've been scaring them a little bit. We've tried not to, but this is frightening stuff. You know, this is supposed to put my life or my safety or my well-being at risk, or my families or my coworkers. So what we're doing now is all the communication up to this point has been about mobilizing, responding, managing. I mean, we've been playing forward pass football here. We're going for everything, you know. Suddenly, we are now demobilizing. We're trying to calm down, and we're trying to do a pulse and respiratory check on everyone. Are you okay? What do you need? Here's what's going on. I'm not going to leave you in the dark. Here's what we're learning. Because you've got to begin to turn down the tension meter. You've got, I mean, I always say this. I want you to spend all your efforts getting people focused and alert, and I want them to pay attention to this, and I want them to act. And now I'm saying I want you to get everybody to calm down, to get you know, back to a sense of where they can listen and think and process, and let's find out what they need. And so you manage the resolution of your people, processes, and operations the same way you manage the threat to those people's processes and operations back earlier on in it. This is the mirror image, except now the thing you're managing is really aftermath. Does that make sense, Jim?
It does, and I think it's a good way for us to focus here. Now, I know you're going to talk about where some of those stresses could come from, and let's go through and take these stresses and emphasize those, and talk about what the messaging might be for each of the ones that we see.
Sure. These are pulled just from some of the things that when we do the case studies and assessments, we're learning why people are not following or paying attention, or communication problems in terms of doing it, and the kind of vulnerabilities that are emerging. So, you know, one of them is that we have people, particularly after, you know, certain kinds of extended periods during these events of managing it, they report what we describe as emotional exhaustion. You know, just can't take this in. And it's not just I need a day to get away, although that's not a bad idea. But it's that you ever just all been all cried out? You know, you just can't do much more of this. You know, we find with emotionally exhausted people, we change the tone of messaging, and we focus on helping them recover. And I think getting them to some sort of support facilities or wellness operations is very important. Emotional exhaustion comes from taking the emotional burden off of them. So you write messages and you design particular information strategies which do not continue to load emotional burdens on people. You try to tell them, these are things you don't have to worry about. Here's what we're doing. Now, you can get into trouble. I have a very famous example. I won't name it, but it came after the 9/11 attacks, where you have someone who's trying to give emotional exhaustion support, saying, don't worry about it, you have a job forever, even if we go bankrupt and we don't exist anymore. Well, that's a little bit of a silly promise, because if you don't exist anymore, you can't really promise people lifetime employment. But I know why someone says that, and I know why people who are so emotionally depleted, that sounds good. So how do we talk that way without, promising things we really can't keep? Another is that we find people high levels of anxiety and measured depression. Now, if any of you have ever dealt with medical depression, you know how debilitating it can be. We have both, well, actually, if you look on the medical literature, there's several kinds of depression. We find post-event depression is something that comes about. People are hard to motivate. People worry. We find sleep disorders. We find eating disorders. There's so much that comes from these post-events. It's just getting home and realizing that the guy with the gun was outside my door, and had he turned and moved that handle, who knows what would have happened. There's so many things. So we want messaging strategies that deal with this. I think you want professional help. There are people with all different levels of psychological distress. And what's your plan? What's your plan? I guess they're calling you, Jim, about this point. They're calling, and they're basically saying, what do we do? We've had this horrific event. People are traumatized, and they're zombies, and that sort of thing. The other thing that we noticed in the reviews is that when people come back, they have a hard time getting back to work. I mean, we find measurably high levels of distraction, inability to focus. It's really hard. And so you've got to have some concern, care, motivation. You've got to have messaging that addresses that. In fact, this is the wrong time to send a threatening letter about we need to improve our productivity around this office. Really backfires. Bad message strategy. So we want message strategies that don't excuse distraction and ability to focus, but understand the root causes of it and gradually work people back up. The same is true in decision making. We actually find what we call lingering bad decision making. We find people go through these events really do dumb things for sometimes afterwards. And you've got to actually come and focus on that. This is like, what is it? What's the old cliche? You can't address the problem unless you have a problem, and that's true in this. Boy, the one thing for those of you who are pragmatists out there, high job absenteeism rates after these events. People stay home and hug their kids or grandkids, and they use up all their sick leave. If you are actually trying to coordinate recovery, which we're not even to yet, but you need to anticipate that this can lead to real problems in recovery, because you may not have key people there, or at least not in sufficient numbers. In fact, some people, we've got instances after these events of people who just are unable to come back into the office or at work. And I'm going to take a very humane approach here. I don't think you have someone endure a horrible disaster or event. I don't care if it's a tornado devastates the building, or plague, or pandemic, or a gunman. It really doesn't matter to me. But you ought to have a plan, and you ought to think about that into wellness programs, benefits, whether it involves counseling or I mean, there's so much there. You need to anticipate. These are things that are coming out of it. Of course, both we find people who have traumatic effects during these events, and I have a whole separate workshop I teach about intense negative emotions, what happens to people. But of course, we have very much a dysfunctional disorder we call traumatic stress disorder that occurs during an event. Of course, sometimes traumatic stress disorders are not limited to the event. They echo and linger. In fact, you all know that as post-traumatic stress disorder. That means we're not in a traumatic situation anymore. We're not in a stressful situation, but yet we continue to relive it, live in it, and echo it. What kind of messages? Well, this is really simple. You've got to get a resolution out there that is and be totally cognizant of where people are at. If you treat this just as an event, yes, we had a gunman, but now it's over, so everything's happy, hunky-dory, we're back to normal. I personally think you've set yourself up for lots of misunderstandings, dysfunctions, and I'm encouraging you to consider what's going on in the aftermath as you think about that. And yes, that involves your communication plans. You may want to cancel some board meetings, some team meetings or deadlines. You may want to adjust those. You may want to send out a note that says you're doing that. Just letting me know that you're aware of what I'm going through, that you have sympathy for it, that the worst kind of messages you can send would be those that are completely unsympathetic to what we've just been through. And I've actually had some very frank conversations with people, and they say, well, Bob, this is our work. We got to get back to business. Yes, I understand that. In fact, I'm all there. I'm all there with that. But if you really want to get back to business for the long term, you ought to think about the short term and how you talk about the event. In fact, some people do want to talk about the event. I haven't even talked about that yet. I think we're going to do more of that in the recovery thing. But you need to have that in your long-term plans too. So basically, what's important, okay, is you need to pay attention to how you're going to communicate in this post-event. The gunman's down, the tornado has passed, the well has been capped. That affects the emotional well-being, the physical well-being of everybody. And of course, I would say you should do this throughout the entire life cycle. I emphasize it here because I think it's the one time where you have a little bit more time because you're not juggling some other things now. Those things have passed off, but it's also the time where it's most often overlooked. I think it's imperative to do it during this phase because many people need your communication. We all need you to talk us through this, all right? I would need you to talk me through this if I'd been through something like this. And as the acute phase of the crisis has ended, we now begin the longer-term recovery phase, and this is our transitional phase to that, the resolution phase. And I'm merely suggesting that you have a plan for this phase. I hope this is not an overwhelming concept. I want to call your attention to it and suggest that you have a plan. And again, I don't believe one size fits all, but I do believe you can tailor these goals, strategies, and principles, and actually have a plan in place for, what are we going to do? What, how, when, where, who are we going to talk to, about, and with once the tornado has passed, once the floodwaters have receded. And yes, many of you want to jump right into, well, we've got a cleanup crew coming to pump out the floodwaters in the basement, and we'll talk about that. That's right after this. This is not this here is not an extended period. The next one's very long, but this is really let's stop and check our pulse and check our heart rate, and let's talk to people. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think the headline here, return to a new normal, it's going to be different after the event.
Oh, yes, you're right.
It is different. And if we fail to see that, if we fail to acknowledge it, then we're setting ourselves up. The statistics around locations after there's been an event from a turnover perspective are horrific. We obviously do a lot of work with workplace violence, and you look at a location where there's been a shooting or an event, expect turnover in those areas, and it's just not going to be the same as we look through each one of these areas. So, Bob, I think the call that you gave us today, which says you need to have a plan here. You've got to communicate the resolution. You've got to be sensitive to what's going on inside of the people. You've got to set this up, because if you don't, you're not going to get to the recovery, and you're not going to get to all the other things, because there's still a lot of work to be done. And we at Firestorm, as we work together, talk about predict, plan, perform. And I think you've laid out very effectively to predict what's going to be happening during this phase. And we've talked about what kind of plan do we need to put in place to deal with it. And then we have to execute on the plan. We've got to perform. So understanding the vulnerabilities, the threats, the impacts, how we're going to monitor those, the triggers to know now we need to do this communications here becomes so very, very critical. And planning all of this out before the event occurs, or if we have something new that's come, we're going to have a plan during the event to get us through to that next side and step, and then executing on that plan. So I think we all want to know what's going to happen tomorrow, but clearly someone that's been through a disaster is really going to want to know that. And that's our responsibility to communicate and to reinforce and help at this point. Because can you afford not to do that and not to know? The answer is no. That's going to lead to the other areas. I would encourage you to participate in a virtual exercise with your team, to go through and focus on this time in the exercise. What are we communicating at each stage? and how are we going to do that. We did a virtual exercise last month. We're going to plan one for the fourth quarter in November or December around cyber breach. That gives you another opportunity. You've got to make sure your plans align to best practices, and the intelligence network will feed us the information and share with us who is having a problem here, who does need help, and how do we need to do that. Now, you can download a brief from today's webinar by going to Firestorm and Briefs, and you'll have a chance to download the brief for this the fifth stage in this process, and I would encourage everybody to do that and to learn more about what is happening next. The sixth of this session is coming up, and you can register on firestorm.com. We'll send another blast announcement, and that'll be coming in the next few weeks. And not this week, but next week, look for us at the DRJ, where you'll hear us talk about these types of topics and have a chance to meet with Dr. Chandler and look at your plans. If you've got questions, you can go to firestorm.com, or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or give us a call at 800-321-2219. Thanks, Dr. Chandler. Any last words before we let everyone go about their normal day?
No. Enjoy the normal day and think about how you get back to a normal day when the next thing happens.
Thanks for your help. We appreciate the guidance through a crisis, and now we'll be talking about recovery next time. Have a great day, everyone. See you at the DRJ. Goodbye.